like to, if I can, introduce Professor Carter Chan to you. She is the director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She's an expert on German Protestant churches and Christian minority groups in Nazi Germany. She's an expert on Christian anti-Semitism and religion and rescue during the Holocaust. These are the themes we will be working with for the next week. So we're very grateful for Dr. Carter Chan to be with us. Before coming to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, which I encourage you all to visit. If you go to Washington, make sure to visit this amazing museum there in memorializing the Holocaust of the Nazi era. Before going to the museum, Dr. Carter Chan was a visiting assistant professor at Clark University in Worcester, and also worked at Lakeland University in Canada, and was a Cummings Foundation Fellow at the Holocaust Museum in 2012-2013. She received her PhD in Jewish Studies from the University of Toronto in 2016, has a master's from Queen's University in Ontario, and BA Honors from Crandall University in New Brunswick. We're grateful to her for being with us and for sharing her expertise on this topic, which fits so well into our curriculum and into the questions that we are studying. I'm going to bring up Professor Carter Chan's PowerPoint, and then I will hand over the microphone to her. Let's have a nice welcome.
Thank you so much. That's really nice. Wonderful to be here. I don't think I've been in a university classroom since before COVID. I've been, so much is happening on Zoom these days, so it's really nice to be here on a campus and see some of your buildings and meet some people and talk with you today. I know this is a pretty short class, so we're going to jump right into it, but hopefully we will have time for questions and discussion at the end, which I'm very happy to do, so please do save those questions. Is the mic level okay? Can everyone hear me good? Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. All right, the German churches, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust. This is a lot to cover in one lecture, and so this is really just dipping our toe into the water of this field, which I spend so much of my professional life talking about. But I want to start by just observing that in both the Christian and Jewish traditions, there's this concept of sins of commission and sins of omission, right? So like doing things that are wrong, but also failing to do the right things. And all too often in discussions about the Christian churches and the Holocaust, there's this emphasis on silence, or what the churches failed to do. For instance, there's a whole field of study about the silence, or apparent silence of Pope Pius XII, who was Pope from 1939 to 58. People have rightly asked, why did he not speak out and condemn the persecution and mass murder of Jews? Why did he not speak out to encourage Catholics around the world to resist? On the Protestant side, there are similar questions about silence. And we can look to some of the earliest statements of that the Protestant Church in Germany made after the end of the war, like the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt. And I have it here. If you just read the part in bold, it says, "We accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently." And so this declaration was seen as inadequate by many international Christians at the time when it was made, who pointed out that it only addressed sins of omission, not commission. So I'd like to start with a story about a Protestant pastor, Martin Niemöller, who was a leading Protestant pastor in Germany. He became an outspoken opponent of Hitler and the Nazi movement. He was a leader in the Confessing Church, which I'll explain more about what that is a bit later. He spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in concentration camps in Germany. So he was arrested and spent the rest of the time in prison, in concentration camps for being outspoken. He's most famous for this post-war confession, which, just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard some variation of the first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist, then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist, then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew, and then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. Some variation on that. Many, yes, it is extremely famous and has been used in many different contexts. And indeed, these words end the permanent exhibition at the museum where I work in Washington. So as people are leaving, the final thing that they see on the wall is Niemöller's words. And I think they do challenge us all to confront our inaction in terms of us and others. But many people are surprised to learn that Martin Niemöller was an ardent German nationalist. He harbored very typical anti-Jewish stereotypes and prejudices that were typical of his day. And he even voted for the Nazi Party twice, in 1924 and again in 1933. His famous post-war confession that you see here on the screen grew out of a reckoning with this past. He told German audiences just a few months after the end of the war, after he was liberated by the Allies, and he went back to Dachau outside of Munich and was reflecting after having learned more of what had just happened during the course of World War II. And he said, my alibi accounted for the years 1937 to 1945. Those were the years that he was imprisoned. He went on to say, but from 1933 to 1945, for those earlier years, but God was not asking me where I had been from 1937 to 1945, but from 1933 to 1945, and for those earlier years, I did not have an answer. 1933, of course, being the year that the Nazis come to power, Hitler becomes chancellor in Germany, and so he's really talking about those pre-war years that led up to the Holocaust. Niemöller did not only remain silent about the arrests of these groups that he lists, socialists, trade unionists, Jews. He didn't just refrain from speaking out because he was too timid or, it was, living in a dictatorship. But he's clear after the war that he was silent because he also disapproved of these groups. And it was only after the war that he really went on this transformation, which is a long journey with a pretty dramatic arc to it. He sort of changed his political views and theological views in pretty dramatic ways. But that didn't come about, in his experience in the concentration camps, but only after. So even though there's been a lot of research published about the churches in Nazi Germany that focuses on what they did do, so historians have looked at clergy and laity and leadership and local parishes and ecumenical bodies, religious professionals. Still, the churches are often spoken about in this passive voice, using the concept of bystanders, which if any of you have studied the Holocaust at all, you might know this sort of paradigm of trying to understand everyone in the orbit as victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. I think the scholarship now would challenge us all to think that those, well, first of all, it's a little more complicated than just those three categories, and there's a lot of fluidity between those categories. But certainly the churches, if we think of them as just standing on the sidelines, sort of watching what was happening around them, and then failing to stand up and do the right thing, that's simply not an accurate picture of what was going on in Nazi Germany. The churches were pillars of German society and played a very important role in shaping people's attitudes and actions during the period of National Socialism and the Holocaust. And so this is what I would like to talk to you about today. First, I'd like to give a bit of context about the religious landscape in Germany. In this period, the vast majority of Germans belonged to a Christian church. They were baptized into a church, usually paid church taxes, and whether they were in the pews on any given Sunday morning is a different question, but they were certainly members and affiliated with one of the two main churches in Germany, the main Protestant church or the Roman Catholic Church. 2/3 were Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, just under 1% was Jewish, and less than 1% belonged to another religious tradition, including a small number of Christian groups that originated in North America and Great Britain. This is where a lot of my own research lies. The Protestant church is made up of Lutheran and Reformed traditions. So the Protestant church and the Roman Catholic Church had long-standing, very close ties to the state. They received subsidies from the government, church taxes, and these continued even into the Weimar period, which is the period after the end of World War I, when Germany became a democracy and had a new constitution, and the constitutions explicitly stated that Germany had no state religion. But still, it's a very different setup than what we find here in the United States. In 1933, I think it's fair to say that most Christians in Germany welcomed the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. But to understand why, and that might sound like a pretty bold statement, I think to understand why, it's helpful to step back and remember that religious folks, however those are counted, are not only shaped by their theological beliefs or religious beliefs, but there were many interconnected factors. So I think this is true in any context, right? Our political leanings and worldview are shaped certainly by theological convictions and religious tradition, but by many other things. So in Germany, these included German nationalism, a backlash against this Weimar Republic and its liberal values, fierce anti-communism, and people saw Hitler and the Nazis as being very anti-communist, which they were, and so it was sort of a buffer or a bulwark against communism. That was a big draw for many people. Protestants had this long tradition of a lot of loyalty to the government. Maybe for Catholics and some of these smaller groups on the slide, there might have been more efforts to sort of prove their loyalty to the government and show that they were truly German and loyal to the state. Along with all of these factors, of course, we must add anti-Semitism to the mix, because there was a real convergence of Nazi anti-Semitism with a widespread anti-Jewish prejudice that had been embedded in European Christianity for hundreds of years, and which the Nazis really capitalized on. I don't have time to go into much detail on the long history of anti-Semitism. That would be a different lecture. But I will say that the Holocaust Museum has a quite succinct and helpful video that is on our website that does trace the long history of anti-Semitism, and you can quickly go there. I should have put the actual link on the slide, but you can get there from the main page. And it really traces this long history of anti-Semitism, and it's just 13 minutes long. But to mention just a few important points in this legacy of anti-Semitism is this idea of supersessionism. Here you see from medieval Europe, the personified church and synagogue, so synagoga, ecclesia and synagoga, which personified church and synagogue. You always see synagoga looking down, or often she's blindfolded, and it reflects this idea that the Jews, they're collectively, as personified by synagoga, they're blind to the truth of Christianity, or reluctant to embrace it. And there's all sorts of other sort of symbolism that's embedded in what they're holding and how they're close and everything. But it reflects this idea that after Jesus, God's old covenant with the Jews was no longer valid, and this led to a lot of the anti-Jewish ideas throughout the centuries. Another very important piece I want to just touch on is the blood libel. This is a rumor that accuses Jews of kidnapping and murdering Christian children in order to use their blood for religious rituals. First one was in first time that this rumor, this accusation came up, often leading to violence. The first one was in 1154. It happened all over Europe, just sort of popping up in different places, persisting sometimes into the 19th or even 20th century. Another important sort of moment in the history of anti-Judaism in the European Christian tradition would be Martin Luther, Protestant reformer, of course, also a German national hero. He of course wrote some pretty terrible things about Jews in this pamphlet on the Jews and their lies, including calling for the unleashing of violence against Jews. Calls for setting fire to synagogues and schools and whatnot. Now, it's important in these very, very quick examples, which are barely scratching the surface, but it's important to recognize that I'm not saying that Nazi anti-Semitism is exactly the same as these few examples that I've just shown. Anti-Semitism took on political and racial forms in the 19th century, and then the Nazis radicalized their anti-Jewish ideology in some other pretty important ways. But what I am saying is that the Nazis used these kinds of Christian symbols and expressions of anti-Semitism that were really quite old. They used them precisely because they knew they would resonate with people. So I have just a couple of examples of how the Nazis did this. This is Der Stürmer, is one of the very most anti-Semitic newspapers in Nazi Germany. Every front page has some kind of anti-Semitic messaging, but often around Easter, like around the very time of year, each year, they would run a cover story of the deicide charge, or this idea that the Jews collectively had killed Christ and were responsible for Jesus' death on the cross. Here is really sort of fascinating rhetorically what this front cover is doing. So if we look at the caption, it says, "The Jews nailed Christ onto the cross and thought he was dead. He is risen. They nailed Germany to the cross and thought it was dead, and it is risen more gloriously than ever before." So on the one hand, they're drawing on this very old trope of the deicide charge. On the other hand, something really quite recent, which is the so-called stab in the back myth, which emerged toward the end of World War I, certainly after World War I. Hitler was a big proponent of this idea of that Germany hadn't really lost World War I on the battlefront. It wasn't the military's fault that Germany lost the war. Instead, the military was stabbed in the back by the home front. Right? It was these people, the Jews and socialists and other sort of people that he didn't like, who were back on the home front, who had caused Germany to lose the war. And so here he's saying, they, meaning the Jews, nailed Germany to the cross and thought it was dead, and now it is, risen up again. So you see these sort of combining of very old and pretty recent ideas. Another example comes from an illustrated children's book, of all things, called The Poisonous Mushroom. This is an illustrated book, again, as a propaganda tool for children. Every page contains a different piece of messaging about anti-Semitic ideas for children. And you see here, these kids looking up at a crucifix. When you see a cross, remember the gruesome act of murder. So again, promoting the deicide charge, and then on the other one, baptism didn't make them into non-Jews. So this is this idea that Jewish identity was supposedly, in Nazis' ideology, it was a racial category, not a religious category. So even if Jews had baptized and were attending church, it didn't matter. It didn't make them not Jewish. And this is really at the core of Nazi racial ideology. It's also important to recognize that when we're thinking about what did Christians think about all of these things, that Christians' hostility to Jews was not only theologically based. They absorbed many of the negative stereotypes that were just floating around in society. So I have this other example of a Catholic Cardinal Bertram. This is from Berlin. And this is very early on in the regime, in the spring of 1933, when the Nazis called for a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. And so it was planned for April 1st, and on that day, everyone was supposed to avoid going to any Jewish shops or Jewish-owned businesses. And because it was sort of announced ahead of time, people knew it was coming up. And Cardinal Bertram was approached by another a businessman in Berlin who was also involved with interfaith work, and was asked, would you speak out against this boycott? And, it's obviously wrong and unjust. And Cardinal Bertram said, no, I don't think that's really the right thing for me to do. And he writes this response. He lists several reasons. Like, he gives reasons. I know it's probably too small for you to read, so I'll just sort of summarize. He said, oh, well, everyone kind of knows the terms of this debate, and they already have their mind made up one way or the other, whether the boycott is a good idea or not. Nothing that I could say would really change people's minds. That it's not really my place to speak out. He gives all these reasons. And then at the very end, this line, I'm just going to turn around and read it exactly. The very last sentence, one might mention in passing that the press, which is overwhelmingly in Jewish hands, has remained consistently silent about the persecution of Catholics in various countries. So he's, relying on this common stereotype of the Jewish-controlled media, which is not a theological idea at all. But I guess my point is here you have a cardinal who's also combining these different forms of anti-Semitism. When we think about the churches as institutions collectively, we know that more Protestants voted for the Nazi Party than did Catholics. Here, this map just shows, so you can read it, the brown NSDAP, of course, is the Nazi Party. These are the areas in which they won the majority. The black is the Central Party with the Catholic Party. So you see these more Catholic areas, the Rhineland and then down in Bavaria, in these more Catholic parts of the country, they, makes sense, voted for the Catholic Center Party. The bright red is the SPD is the Democratic Socialist Party, and the darker red would be the Communist Party. So it sort of maps onto the more majority Protestant areas versus Catholic areas and how they voted. So in fact, in the early 1930s, as Hitler's movement was gaining steam, there was a lot of hostility towards Nazism from Catholic leadership. And of course, our colleague Kevin Spicer, who I understand was just here on campus a few days ago, has written a lot about this if you're ever interested in reading more on German Catholics. But bishops banned Catholics from joining the party early on, and some priests refused to allow Nazis who were actually wearing their uniform to come and receive the sacraments or participate in church events. They opposed to the Nazis' nationalism, obsession with race, and although they didn't really say much about anti-Semitism, that was not one of their critiques. The church changed its policy after the Nazis actually came to power. You might say it in a very practical move. And in early speeches, Hitler was really trying to promote this idea that he promised the churches that they would be protected and not restricted. There were so many little fears that especially Catholics had about religious instruction in school or the display of crucifixes in school as opposed to Nazi symbolism. And Hitler really made a big effort to reassure the churches. Going back to 1920, this is just a part of the Nazi Party platform, which they issued as a very young political movement in 1920. And even here it says the party upholds the point of view of positive Christianity without tying itself to any one confession or denomination, we might say here in North America. Now, if you're sort of confused by this term, positive Christianity, you're not alone. I think it's an intentionally sort of vague term, but it at least gave people some reassurance that there was a place for Christianity within the Nazi worldview. And then in 1933, when Hitler first comes to power, we have several examples of him making explicit promises to the churches. We have this radio address: the national government will maintain and defend the foundations on which the power of our nation rests. It will offer strong protection to Christianity on the basis of our collective morality. And then in his opening speech to the Reichstag, the German parliament, he says the government regards the two Christian confessions as the most important factors for the preservation of our national culture. And he specifically says he guarantees the Christian confessions their due influence in school and educational matters. So really speaking to people's concerns at the time. Just a few months later, in July of 1933, a concordat was signed between the Holy See and Germany. A concordat is a treaty between the Catholic Church and a secular government. And this concordat promised to protect the rights of German Catholics. As the years went on, Pope Pius XI and then his successor, Pius XII, pursued a real policy of neutrality. And so we can see how this combination of some underlying anti-Semitism, as evidenced in a few of the examples that I just gave, and a very strong desire to protect the safety and the rights of Catholics led Catholic leadership to not publicly condemn, the increasing persecution of Jews. And I just mentioned that something ongoing at this very moment is that in 2020, the Vatican opened the archives of the period of Pope Pius XII, 39 to 58, so exactly in the war years before they were not yet opened. And so it's, 15 million pages of documents spread over several different archives. And so one of the projects that the Holocaust Museum is involved in right now is we are over there in the archives trying to identify materials that may be relevant for Holocaust research and making scans and bringing them back to add to our archival collections at the museum. So some of this, history is still, in the coming years, there will be more to say. I'm sure historians will have new insights based on new evidence, which is always exciting as a historian to think about. So as I just mentioned, Hitler made these real efforts to appease Catholics and Christians in general in the early days. And Hitler was very concerned about public opinion, and at this time, and while he was still consolidating power, and he was very savvy. Certainly he's savvy enough to know that it would not be good to alienate the churches. Indeed, even some of these smaller churches that I had on a previous slide, groups like the Seventh-day Adventists, the Baptists, the Salvation Army, Quakers, these groups were not banned in Nazi Germany. They might have been monitored and maybe viewed with suspicion, but they were not banned, especially ones that had strong institutional ties with Great Britain and the United States. They could be very powerful, sort of soft propaganda tools for Nazi Germany. It was really only the Jehovah's Witnesses and a very small handful of more esoteric religious communities that were ever banned by the Nazis. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, it was really about their refusing to demonstrate publicly loyalty to the state. So the Jehovah's Witnesses pretty consistently would refuse to give the Hitler salute in everyday life. They refused to fly the flag, send their kids to the Nazi youth group. Certainly the men refused to do military service, which is one of the core convictions of the Jehovah's Witnesses, to not bear arms for the state. But it was not only men of military age that got in trouble with the government, but it was just whole families of Jehovah's Witnesses. I put some of the numbers up here on the slide, and as you may know, Jehovah's Witnesses originated in the 19th century here in the United States. But at this time, the second largest place of a Jehovah's Witness community was in Germany, in fact. So it was pretty sizable. And they were arrested in such high numbers that they actually got their own symbol in the concentration camp system of the purple triangle. You might have heard of some, of course, the Jews wearing the yellow star, gay men often identified with the pink triangle, political prisoners wore the red triangle, and Jehovah's Witnesses the purple triangle. So again, there's a lot more to say about Jehovah's Witnesses and some of these other smaller groups. But I do want to leave time to say some more things about the Protestant church and the pretty dramatic responses that came out of the Protestant church. There was a range of responses to the Nazis and the Nazi government, and really a struggle for control of the church emerged between those who wanted to create a Nazified church, the people who were very pro-Nazi and wanted to bring the Protestant church in that direction, and then others who opposed that idea, and then, probably not surprisingly, a whole bunch of people in the middle who just wanted to stay neutral and not commit to either side. So the German Christians, this is the specific name of their movement. I know it sounds very generic, but it's not just Germans who were Christians, but their name, Deutsche Christen, had a vision for what they called a racially pure church, and they began attacking what they saw as Jewish influences on Christianity. So they harassed Christians who had converted from Judaism to Christianity. They tried to bar these Christians. The terminology of the day was non-Aryan Christian. They tried to bar them from being ministers, from being pastors. Some of them even rejected the Old Testament. They denied the Jewishness of Jesus. They said Jesus was an Aryan. And even tried to remove words like Hosanna or Hallelujah or Zion from the Bible and from hymns and things like this. The German Christians were really at their peak right at the beginning of this really pivotal year of 1933 with the new government. And again, I can't assume that y'all have taken a course in Nazi Germany or Holocaust. So Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 1933 that year. It wasn't a coup. He came into power through the democratic means that were laid out in the Constitution, but very quickly moved Germany from a democracy into a dictatorship. So that's sort of the timeline that we're talking about at the moment. So this German Christian movement was really, really popular in 1933. When the best estimate that we have is maybe 1/3 of Protestant pastors joined the movement. We don't have accurate numbers on regular lay people, but it was sort of a thing that you could, mail in your name and get a card and be part of the movement. It's very important to understand that this movement came from within the churches. This is not something that was imposed on the churches by the Nazis, but this was a sort of an internal movement from within the Protestant churches. And many of its proponents were actually highly educated theologians and biblical scholars. There's a brand new book that just came out this past year, an edited volume called Betrayal of the Humanities, which talks about lots of different disciplines in the universities in Germany and how they navigated those years during the Nazi period, and many of them were quite, a range from sympathetic or outright supportive of the Nazi movement. When these German Christians tried to actually make the step of removing non-Aryan Christians from their posts as clergy or officials in church government, there was a real backlash. And the people who opposed this were really concerned that the church was just too influenced by the secular government, by the Nazi government. They wanted to maintain church independence and their theological integrity. And so there emerged this coalition led by Pastor Niemöller, and we started with his quote today, and some other famous leaders might probably have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and this is where the confessing church really emerges. Its founding statement was the Barmen Declaration, largely written by the Protestant theologian, Reformed theologian Karl Barth. And it condemned Nazified theology as false doctrine, but it didn't protest or criticize the Nazi state itself. They were just concerned about church affairs. And so the confessing church is often seen as sort of a resistance movement against Nazism. It's not quite accurate to say it because they did limit their protest to church affairs and how this was affecting the church itself. Some people have called it a loyal opposition. It might sound like an oxymoron, but a loyal opposition I think is very accurate to describe it. And in fact, it's a very good description of Martin Niemöller himself. We think about, I said he was very much a German nationalist. He was imprisoned by the Nazis in 1939. World War II breaks out. He hears about the beginning of the war while he is in a concentration camp. And what does he do? He volunteers to go serve in the German Navy, as he had done in World War I. He was that, he was that tied to his country, and that sort of level of patriotism. He had served in the German Navy in World War I, so even while he was being persecuted, for opposing the present government and its policies, he still had this larger German identity, if that at all makes sense. I want to say that, I had another slide here that just gives a few other keywords of the church struggle, and this is really the term that emerged to describe this controversy between the German Christians on the one hand and the confessing church on the other hand. But here's I wanted to make sure that I mentioned this idea of, I know your class is really focused on race and religion, and what is it, the crisis of democracy? Struggle for democracy. Okay, so all of these themes really are encapsulated in this next slide. Because Nazi ideology was based on what they saw as a racial framework. This idea that there were distinct biological races in the world, and that you could separate out everyone into a distinct race that was, biologically defined, and that there was a hierarchy to those, right? So obviously, Aryans were at the top, Jews were at the bottom, as were people of color, and Slavs were pretty low on the list as well. Other sort of Northern Europeans were higher up on the list. But this was the racial model that they were working with. That in itself was not unique to Nazi Germany. That was just sort of the way that most of the Western world understood race at the time. But race was wrapped up with religion in some pretty complex ways that may be interesting for this class to consider. Because as the Nazis began to exclude German Jews from public life, so they had, every week there was a new measure that came out. You can't sit on park benches, you can't go to the cinema, you can't go to the public schools, you can't have a driver's license, you can't, right? It just went on and on and on of excluding German Jews from just everyday life in society, something that historian Marion Kaplan has called social death. So before there was physical death, there was a sort of social death. And as this process went on, beginning in 1933, but going on, they needed a legal framework to actually come up with, to determine who counted as a Jew. And this is something that was not quite as straightforward as you might think. And so the Nuremberg laws were introduced in the summer and fall of 1935. Nuremberg laws are made up of two separate laws. The first, the Reich citizenship law, stripped Jews of their German citizenship. and then it introduced a framework for determining who counted as a Jew, and this is what is shown on this chart. The second law was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, banned future intermarriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans. We might say more accurately, Jewish Germans and non-Jewish Germans. So they tried to make race about biology in this chart, but since there was no physical marker, right? Like obviously there's no blood tests or other tests that anyone could do, they had to rely on religion. And so what they ended up doing was relying on a person's, the religion of one's grandparents. So in this chart, if you had 4 German grandparents who were baptized Christians, you were considered Aryan, full Aryan German. If you had 1 grandparent who was part of the Jewish community, or 2 grandparents on one on each side, you were in this in-between category. And if you had 4 Jewish grandparents, then you were considered fully Jewish. And again, this was based on how your grandparents were registered. Were they baptized as infants and on the register of a church, or were they part of the Jewish community? Now, when I showed you the pie chart a few minutes ago, I showed that over 97% of Germans belong to a Christian church. This is because, as a matter of course, in Germany, people were generally baptized into the church of their parents, either the Protestant or the Catholic Church. And so what happened under this framework when the Nuremberg laws came into effect is some people who were practicing Christians, realized that their grandparents, in fact, had been Jewish. Some people were kind of secular, unaffiliated, never went to church, and they didn't even know they had a Jewish background. So you would, people were obligated, especially if they had, jobs in the government or there were certain reasons that you would want to prove your German or Aryan blood. And so the churches were actually drawn into this process in a pretty significant way, because suddenly you have all these people going to their local church saying, can I see the baptismal certificates of my family? Can I see the church records to prove that my grandparents were actually Christians? Of course, at the time, the churches didn't really think of this as a problem. This is, what they did. You go to a church, they provide, church records all the time for all sorts of reasons. But just looking back on it now, we can see that this was actually made it possible to implement this whole racial framework and measures of exclusion. I know I focused a lot, I should wrap it up very quickly, but I know I focused a lot on the early years of Nazi rule because they were very crucial. But I do want to mention that anti-Nazi sentiment within the churches began to grow. People became more disillusioned with Nazism, became more uncomfortable as the years went on. There were protests in some cases. I want to mention just really quickly one significant example of a Catholic bishop from Munster, Bishop von Gallagher, who gave a sermon in the summer of 1941 against the Nazis' clandestine and systematized murder of patients in institutions with disabilities. These were not necessarily Jews, but people in German society with disabilities, called the P4 program, or sometimes the Nazi euthanasia program. And by 1941, word had gotten out about this. It was kind of an open secret in society. And Bishop von Gallagher gave a sermon where he laid out many reasons why this was wrong, why other Germans should protest it. And it did have some significant influence on people's opinions and what followed. Interesting thing, and I think important to balance, because you might look at this story and say, wow, he was really showed a lot of moral courage. On the other hand, Bishop Bongala never spoke out against the persecution of Jews that was going on. So, we always have to hold these things in tension when we're considering individuals and institutions and their behavior during this period. So in order to leave time for questions, I probably should stop there. But yeah, happy to answer any questions or hear your comments.